In the spring of 1945, as American forces pushed deep into the heart of Nazi Germany, Sergeant Daniel Carter of the 1st Infantry Division lay dying in a makeshift field hospital near the Rhine River, his body shattered by German machine gun fire during the crossing at Remagen. The Army nurse who refused to let him die, Lieutenant Grace Matthews from a small town in Virginia, worked through the night with a determination that defied medical logic, performing procedures she'd never been trained for, using supplies that were dangerously depleted, driven by something more than professional duty. Daniel survived against all odds, was evacuated back to the States, and spent months in recovery convinced he'd never see Grace again, that she was just an angel who'd appeared in his darkest moment and vanished back into the chaos of war. But Daniel Carter was the kind of man who kept promises, even unspoken ones. And when the war ended and Grace returned to America, Daniel began a cross-country search to find the nurse who'd saved his life, not just to say thank you, but because somewhere between the blood and the morphine and her steady hands holding him to this world, he'd fallen completely in love with her. This is the story of a soldier who survived impossible odds, and the nurse whose skill and courage gave him a second chance at life and at love. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more untold wartime love stories that history almost forgot. Tell me, what's your name, soldier? Daniel Carter had enlisted in the United States Army in December 1941, 3 days after Pearl Harbor. Like millions of other young American men who understood that their country had been thrust into a war it could no longer avoid. He was 20 years old, from a farming family in rural Kansas, the eldest of 5 children, accustomed to hard work and responsibility. Daniel had planned to take over the family farm eventually, marry his high school sweetheart Sarah, live the quiet, predictable life that generations of Carters had lived before him. But Pearl Harbor changed everything. The quiet life would have to wait. First, there was a war to win, fascism to defeat, a world to save. Daniel trained as an infantryman, joined the 1st Infantry Division, the famous Big Red one, and shipped overseas in 1942. He fought in North Africa, Sicily, and Normandy, survived battles that killed men on either side of him, earned sergeant's stripes through competence and courage under fire. By March 1945, Daniel had been in combat for nearly 3 years. He'd seen friends die, had killed enemy soldiers, had experienced horrors that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He was exhausted, worn down by endless combat, but also grimly determined to finish the job. Germany was collapsing, Allied forces closing in from east and west, Hitler's 1,000-year Reich crumbling after just 12 years. The end was in sight. Daniel just had to survive a little longer. The 1st Infantry Division had been assigned to capture the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, one of the last intact bridges across the Rhine River. Taking the bridge would give Allied forces a direct route into Germany's industrial heartland, potentially shortening the war by months. But the Germans defended it fiercely, knowing its strategic importance. On March 7, 1945, Daniel's company was among the first American units to assault the bridge. German artillery and machine guns swept the approaches. The bridge itself had been rigged with explosives. The Germans tried to blow it as American forces advanced, but the demolition charges failed to completely destroy the structure. American soldiers rushed across the damaged bridge under intense fire, establishing a foothold on the eastern bank. Daniel was halfway across when German machine gun fire found him. 3 rounds struck him in the chest and abdomen, punching through his combat uniform, causing catastrophic internal damage. He went down hard on the bridge's steel span, bleeding out, consciousness fading, certain he was dying far from home. But his squad mates pulled him off the bridge, got him to a medic who did emergency field treatment, and marked him for immediate evacuation. Daniel was loaded onto an ambulance, transported to the nearest field hospital, and dumped on a stretcher in the triage area where Army nurses were making rapid assessments about which men could be saved and which were beyond help. That's where Lieutenant Grace Matthews first saw him. Grace Matthews was 25 years old in March 1945, an experienced Army nurse who'd been serving with field hospitals since the North African campaign. She came from Virginia, the daughter of a country doctor who'd taught her from childhood that medicine was both science and calling, that sometimes the difference between life and death was simply refusing to give up on a patient. Grace had volunteered for the Army Nurse Corps in 1942, driven by the same patriotic impulse that had motivated millions of Americans after Pearl Harbor. She trained at Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, learned battlefield medicine under simulated combat conditions, and shipped overseas determined to save as many soldiers as she could. She'd served in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, and now Germany, following American forces as they advanced, treating casualties from some of the war's most brutal battles. Grace had saved hundreds of soldiers, performed medical miracles with limited supplies under impossible conditions, earned a reputation as one of the most skilled and dedicated nurses in the European theater. But she'd also lost patience, watched men die despite her best efforts, held hands of soldiers taking final breaths, written letters to families she'd never meet, carried the weight of every patient she couldn't save. The work had hardened her, created emotional armor necessary for survival. Grace had learned to see patients as medical problems rather than as individuals. It was the only way to function without breaking. But when she saw Daniel Carter on that stretcher at Remagen, something in that armor cracked. He was barely conscious, sheet white from blood loss, his uniform soaked with blood. The triage tag indicated catastrophic chest and abdominal wounds, the kind of injuries that usually meant death, even with immediate surgery. Standard protocol would be to make him comfortable with morphine and move on to patients with better survival chances. But Grace looked at Daniel's face. Young, but Daniel was her patient, and there were strict regulations against fraternization between medical staff and patients. Grace maintained appropriate boundaries, kept their interactions professional, despite the growing emotional connection. After 2 weeks, Daniel was stable enough to be evacuated to a rear-area hospital and eventually back to the United States for continued recovery. Grace knew this was goodbye. Once patients left the field hospital, she rarely learned what happened to them. They disappeared into the vast military medical system, and she moved on to the next wave of casualties. The night before Daniel's evacuation, Grace stopped by his bed one final time. "You're going to be fine, Sergeant Carter," she said, keeping her voice clinically professional. "Follow your recovery protocols, do your physical therapy, and you'll make a full recovery." "I owe you my life," Daniel said seriously. "I don't know how to repay that." "You don't owe me anything. I was doing my job." "It was more than your job," Daniel insisted. "Grace, Lieutenant Matthews, I want you to know that you gave me more than medical care. You gave me hope when I had none. You made me believe I could survive. I won't forget that. Or you." Grace felt tears threatening. Unprofessional, inappropriate tears that she forced back. "Take care of yourself, Daniel. Live a good life. That's all the repayment I need." She walked away before either of them could say anything more, before the emotions threatening to overwhelm her professional composure could break through. She told herself it was better this way. Clean break, no complications. Just a nurse and a patient whose paths had crossed briefly during war. But part of her heart walked out of that field hospital with Daniel Carter. Daniel was evacuated to England, then by hospital ship back to the United States. He spent 3 months at Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, undergoing surgeries to repair the damage that Grace's initial emergency work had stabilized. He endured painful physical therapy, learned to walk again, rebuilt strength that combat and injury had stolen. And through it all, he thought about Grace Matthews, the nurse who'd refused to let him die, whose skill and determination had given him a second chance, whose face he remembered more clearly than the faces of some men he'd served with for years. Daniel had been engaged before shipping overseas to Sarah, his high school sweetheart. But Sarah had married someone else in 1943 after 2 years of waiting, unable to endure the uncertainty of loving a man who might never come home. Daniel had received the letter while fighting in Italy, had felt betrayed at first, then understood. War asked too much of everyone, including those who waited at home. Now, recovering in Washington, Daniel realized his feelings for Sarah had been comfortable and familiar, but not the deep connection he'd felt with Grace during those 2 weeks at Remagen. Grace had seen him at his absolute worst, broken, dying, vulnerable, and had fought for him anyway. That created a bond that transcended normal circumstances. Daniel was discharged from the Army in June 1945, returning to Kansas just as the war in Europe ended. His family welcomed him home as a hero, grateful he'd survived when so many hadn't. But Daniel felt incomplete, haunted by unfinished business. He had to find Grace Matthews, had to see her again, thank her properly, determine if the connection he'd felt was real or just wartime intensity that wouldn't survive normal circumstances. But the Army wouldn't provide information about where Grace was serving, security protocols and privacy. Regulations prevented them from sharing personnel locations. Daniel only knew she'd been with a field hospital attached to 1st Army, had served since North Africa, was from somewhere in Virginia. It wasn't much to go on, but Daniel was determined. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Grace remained in Germany through the summer, treating casualties from the final battles and then helping with occupation duties. The work was different, less urgent, fewer combat injuries, more routine medical care for occupation forces. But Grace couldn't shake the memory of Daniel Carter. She told herself it was unprofessional to fixate on one patient among thousands she'd treated. But she wondered constantly whether he'd survived his recovery, whether he'd made it home, whether he ever thought about the nurse who'd saved his life. Grace was finally rotated back to the United States in August 1945, arriving just as Japan surrendered and the entire war finally ended. She was discharged from the Army Nurse Corps in September, returning to Virginia with a chest full of medals, letters of commendation, and psychological scars that would take years to heal. She moved back to her hometown, took a position at the local hospital, tried to readjust to civilian life and medicine that didn't involve combat casualties. But everything felt strange, disconnected. Her wartime experiences had changed her in ways that made normal life feel foreign. One evening in October 1945, Grace was working a shift at the hospital when the front desk called to say someone was asking for her. She came to the lobby and froze. Daniel Carter stood there, wearing civilian clothes, looking healthier than she'd ever seen him. Filled out, color returned to his face, no longer the dying soldier on a stretcher, but a young man fully alive. Daniel? Grace barely managed to say his name. Grace. Lieutenant Matthews. Daniel Carter died in 2003, at age 82. Grace lived another 9 years, dying in 2012 at age 92. They were buried together in Virginia, their headstone bearing both their names, his military rank, her nursing rank, and a simple inscription. He survived because she refused to give up. They loved because survival wasn't enough. Their children donated their parents' wartime papers to the National World War II Museum. Daniel's Purple Heart and combat decorations, Grace's nursing citations and medals, the letters they'd written after reconnecting. Grace's wartime journal that documented her years as a combat nurse. Among those papers was an entry Grace had written the night after Daniel's evacuation from Remagen. Tonight I said goodbye to a patient I probably saved, but will never see again. His name is Sergeant Daniel Carter from Kansas, 23 years old, nearly killed at the Remagen Bridge. I broke protocol to save him, argued for surgery when protocol said, make him comfortable and move on. I don't know why I fought so hard for this particular soldier among thousands, but I couldn't let him die. Something about him made me believe his survival mattered, in ways beyond just preserving one more life. I'll probably never know what happened to him. He'll disappear into the military medical system, recover or not, return to Kansas or not, remember the nurse who saved him or not. But I'll remember him. I'll remember his face, his voice, the way he looked at me with trust and hope even while dying. I'll remember that I refused to give up on him, and I'll wonder, for the rest of my life, what became of Sergeant Daniel Carter. 50 years later, in her final journal entry before her death, Grace wrote, "I found out what became of Sergeant Daniel Carter. He became my husband, the father of my children, my partner for more than half a century. That soldier I saved at Remagen gave me everything. A life, a family, a love that lasted until death finally parted us. I spent my nursing career saving lives, but saving Daniel's life saved mine too, because he came back for me. He searched for months, traveled across the country, risked rejection to tell me he loved me. The soldier returned for the nurse who saved his life, and we built something beautiful from that second chance. The story of Daniel Carter and Grace Matthews represents something profound about wartime relationships, that bonds forged in extreme circumstances can endure and flourish in normal times, that love born from life and death stakes can mature into steady partnership, that the connections we make in our darkest moments sometimes prove to be the most important of our lives. Grace saved Daniel's life through medical skill and sheer determination. But Daniel saved Grace, too, from the emotional detachment that combat nursing required, from losing herself completely in work that demanded everything and gave back mostly trauma, from forgetting that individual patients mattered as human beings rather than just medical problems. Their story also honors the often overlooked contributions of military nurses who served in World War II. More than 59,000 American nurses served during the war, often under fire, frequently in conditions as dangerous as frontline combat. They saved countless lives, performed medical miracles with limited resources, and rarely received the recognition their male counterparts did. Grace Matthews was one of thousands of Army nurses who sacrificed years of their lives to save wounded soldiers. What made her story special wasn't just her medical skill, though that was exceptional, but that one of the soldiers she saved came back for her, proved that her work had meaning beyond clinical outcomes, showed that sometimes saving a life creates bonds that transcend professional duty. The soldier who returned for the nurse who saved his life. It's a love story, yes, a beautiful romance between two people who found each other amid chaos. But it's also a story about gratitude, about recognizing that our lives are shaped by others' sacrifices, about honoring those who save us by living fully and well. Daniel survived because Grace refused to accept that he was beyond saving. And their love survived because both of them understood that what they'd found together, in a field hospital at Remagen, in the worst days of the war's final months, was worth crossing any distance, overcoming any obstacle, building an entire life upon. But this wasn't the only time a soldier returned for the medical professional who'd saved his life. In our next story, you'll meet Lieutenant James Sullivan, a Marine who'd been gravely wounded at Iwo Jima and saved by a Navy corpsman named Robert Chen. And when James returned stateside and learned that Robert had been killed in the battle's final days, James spent the next 50 years honoring his savior's memory by building a life of service, eventually tracking down Robert's family to tell them that their son's courage and skill had meant everything to the man he'd saved.